My brother showed up to Grandma's funeral with an eviction notice and a U-Haul full of frat boys, but her lawyer arrived with a secret that ended his greed forever. Weston didn't cry once at the funeral. He stood by the casket with his phone tilted low against his hip, thumb moving. I found out later he was posting listing photos of the house while the pastor was still talking about ashes and dust. He'd cropped Grandma's rose bushes out of the frame because he said thorny bushes lower a listing price. He told me that himself later, like it was something to be proud of. He'd always known this house was coming to him, not because anyone promised it to him, because he'd decided it, the way he decided most things, and then acted like the decision had already been made by someone else, somewhere official, a long time ago. I remember catching his eye once during the eulogy, while the pastor read a passage Grandma had picked out herself years earlier, and Weston just checked his watch. Subtle, quick, like the service was running long, and he had somewhere better to be. The second the last guest's car pulled out of the driveway, he cornered me by the front door. I still had a paper plate of untouched funeral potatoes in my hand. He slapped a folded piece of paper on the counter like he was doing me a favor by not throwing it at my head. "You've got 30 days to clear out," he said. I looked down at it. Eviction notice. My name typed at the top, misspelled, Danil, instead of Danielle. He hadn't even bothered to get my name right on the document meant to remove me from my own home. "This is a joke," I said. "It's not a joke, it's the law," he said. "Grandma's gone. House goes to family. I'm the oldest. You can find an apartment or you can sleep in your car. I genuinely don't care which." I was still wearing my funeral dress the next morning at 7 a.m. when I heard the U-Haul brakes hiss in the driveway. I looked out Grandma's bedroom window, the one she used to stand at every morning to check the thermometer nailed to the porch post, and I watched my brother climb out of the cab, grinning like he'd won something. 4 of his fraternity brothers piled out behind him, tank tops. One of them was still holding a red plastic cup from whatever they'd been doing the night before their dead grandmother's estate needed clearing out. They walked into the house like they'd bought tickets to it, boxes, tape guns, loud laughing about how much they could flip Grandma's furniture for on a resale app. I stood in the doorway of her bedroom and tried to block it with my body, which is a stupid thing to try against 4 22-year-old men who lift weights for fun, and one of them just put a hand on my shoulder and moved me sideways like I was a piece of furniture that hadn't been tagged for sale yet. "Careful," Weston said, laughing at his own joke. "Don't want you crying on the merchandise." I watched them tear into her dresser, the one with the chipped corner from 1994, the one she ran her hand over every single morning while she drank her coffee, like she was greeting an old friend before she greeted the day. One of the frat boys yanked out the bottom drawer so hard it came off its tracks and hit the floor. "Wait, not that," I said, and lunged for the quilt folded on top, the one she and I made together over 3 winters, stitch by stitch, sitting at her kitchen table with the radio playing oldies stations low enough that we could still talk over it. One of Weston's friends grabbed it out of my hands before I could get a full grip. Weston rolled his eyes. "Let her keep the dusty blanket," he said. "Nobody's buying that anyway." Then he found the jewelry box on her nightstand, the one with the mother-of-pearl inlay that used to catch the morning light just right. He tipped it straight into an open garbage bag. Rings, necklaces, her mother's brooch, the one shaped like a wren, all of it clattering together and disappearing like it was yard sale scrap instead of 80 years of a woman's life. I lunged for it. He held it out of reach over his head, the same exact gesture he used to make with my stuffed animals when I was 6 and he was 11, grinning the same grin, like nothing about him had changed in 20 years except his shoe size. That's when my mother's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out just in time to see the U-Haul half-loaded, the valuables already gone, and me standing on the porch with tears cutting through funeral makeup I hadn't washed off yet. "Why can't you just be happy for your brother?" she said, resting a hand on my shoulder, her voice dripping with a sympathy she'd clearly rehearsed the whole 40 minutes from her house to this one. I didn't get the chance to answer her. A car turned into the driveway behind hers, and a man in a gray suit stepped out and stopped cold at the sight of the moving truck. "Weston," he called out, "what exactly are you doing with your sister's property?" Weston laughed in his face. "She doesn't own anything here. There's no will. I'm the oldest grandchild. It's mine. There's no will," the man said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Which means the estate follows state law, and state law isn't what you think it is." Weston smirked at him, the way he smirked at every adult who'd ever tried to tell him something he didn't want to hear. "Exactly. So it's mine." "No," the man said, and held up a document with a raised seal on it. "Under this state's caregiver statute, when someone provides full-time care for an elderly relative for over 2 years, they inherit priority over relatives who provided none." The driveway went dead silent. Even the frat boys stopped carrying boxes. I didn't know yet what that folder actually contained. I didn't know that a text message would arrive at midnight telling me to check a will that supposedly didn't exist. I didn't know my brother had already been inside Grandma's filing cabinet before any of us got to the house that morning, pulling folders out and stuffing them into his gym bag while the rest of us were still getting dressed for a funeral. All I knew, standing on that porch in a dress with grass stains on the hem, was that something in my brother's face had just changed, and it wasn't fear yet. It was calculation. And in 26 years of being his sister, I'd learned that calculation was the only expression on him that ever meant real trouble was coming. To understand how we got to that driveway, you have to go back 3 years, to a Tuesday in March, when a home health aide called me at work and told me my grandmother had fallen in her bathroom and couldn't get up. I was 23 then, working an assistant marketing coordinator job in Denver that paid $38,000 a year, and and left me feeling, most days, like I was filling out forms for a life I hadn't agreed to live. Grandma Eleanor was 79, living alone in the house in Fort Collins, where she'd raised my mother and later half-raised Weston and me during the 2 years our parents' marriage was falling apart, and nobody wanted to explain to us why. Weston was 28 by then, already 3 years into a job selling commercial insurance that paid him close to $90,000, already renting a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from Grandma's house with a roommate who mostly existed to split the cable bill. He'd visited Grandma twice in the 18 months before her fall. Both times were to ask her for money. The first time was $1,100 for a car repair he never got done, because I found the invoice later, and the car had been repaired at his own expense somewhere else. The second time was $3,000, framed as a loan, for what he called a business opportunity that turned out to be a multi-level marketing supplement company that folded 4 months later. Grandma gave him the money both times. She never mentioned it to me. I found out from bank statements later, when I was the one paying her bills. When the aide called me about the fall, I drove to Fort Collins that night. Grandma had a hairline fracture in her wrist and a black bruise the size of a dinner plate on her hip. The doctor said she could recover fine at home if someone was there. I asked my mother if she could help. My mother said she had her hands full with her second husband's health issues, which was true, and also said, in the same breath, that surely Weston could pitch in since he lived closer. Weston's response, when I called him, was that he had a big presentation that quarter and couldn't take time off, and that Grandma had good insurance, didn't she? So couldn't we just hire someone? I quit my job 6 weeks later. I moved into Grandma's spare room, the one that used to be my mother's childhood bedroom, still papered in a faded rose print from 1974. I told myself it would be temporary. 3 months, maybe 6, until she was steady on her feet again. It was 3 years. I want to be honest about what those 3 years were, because the version people hear later, in the driveway, in the arguments that came after, always gets flattened into something simpler than it was. It wasn't 3 years of quiet, grateful devotion. There were nights I sat in my car in the driveway and screamed into a pillow I kept in the back seat for exactly that purpose. There were mornings I resented the sound of her walker on the hardwood before I'd even had coffee. I missed 2 friends' weddings and my own cousin's baby shower because Grandma had a UTI that made her confused and combative, and I couldn't leave her with anyone else. I turned down a job in Austin that would have paid $62,000 because I couldn't figure out how to take it and also keep her safe. There was a stretch, in the second winter, when Grandma's confusion from a urinary tract infection got bad enough that she didn't recognize me for the better part of 2 days. She called me by my mother's name, asked why I was in her house, once even asked me, in a small frightened voice at 3 in the morning, to call the police because a stranger was in her home. I sat outside her bedroom door that whole night, close enough to hear her if she tried to get up, far enough to give her the privacy of not seeing a stranger's face when she opened her eyes. And I remember thinking, somewhere around 4 a.m., that this was the loneliest I had ever been in my entire life, sitting on a hallway floor listening to my grandmother be afraid of me. But there were good things too, things I didn't expect. I learned she'd been a switchboard operator before she married my grandfather, that she'd once driven to Memphis by herself in 1961 just to see if she could, that she kept a coffee tin full of silver dollars she was saving to split evenly between me and Weston, though by the time I found the tin, there were really only enough dollars left for one modest gift, not 2. We watched every season of a British baking show twice. She taught me to make her pie crust, the one with the vinegar in it, the one nobody in the family could ever replicate from her verbal instructions alone, because she always left out one ingredient on purpose, a habit she found hilarious well into her 80s. Weston, in those same 3 years, visited 11 times. I counted, eventually, because counting felt like the only way to prove to myself I wasn't imagining the imbalance. 4 of those 11 visits were on Christmas or Thanksgiving, when the whole family was already gathering anyway. 2 were the money visits I mentioned. The rest were drop-ins under 30 minutes, usually timed around some errand he was already running nearby, where he'd sit on the porch with Grandma for a bit, let her fuss over him, tell her how good she looked, and leave before any actual caretaking was required of him. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular, the second one I spent living there, because it's the clearest snapshot I have of how differently the 2 of us moved through that house. Grandma had a small stroke scare that October. Nothing severe, but enough that her right hand shook when she got tired, enough that she couldn't manage a turkey the way she used to without help. I spent 3 days in that kitchen, brining the bird in a 5-gallon bucket in the garage because the fridge wasn't big enough, making her mother's stuffing recipe from a card so faded I had to hold it up to the window to read the last line. Weston arrived 40 minutes before we sat down to eat, carrying a bag of dinner rolls from the grocery store like a contribution, and spent the meal talking almost entirely about a promotion he was up for at work. When Grandma's hand shook pouring gravy, he didn't reach over to steady it. I did, without thinking, the way you reach for something falling before your brain has finished registering that it's falling. He didn't seem to notice that at all. He asked for seconds. My mother, watching all of this from her end of the table, never said a word about the imbalance either. She'd compliment my cooking and then, in the same breath, ask Weston about his job, his apartment, whether he was seeing anyone, as if the 2 of us were simply living parallel, equally valid lives that happened to look different from each other, rather than one of us having quietly rearranged an entire life around a dying woman's needs, while the other dropped off bread rolls. There's one incident from that period I think about more than the others, because I understand now that it was a preview of everything that came later, letter, though at the time I read it as nothing more than an ordinary flash of Weston's ordinary selfishness. It was Grandma's 80th birthday, September of the second year. I'd spent 2 days cooking, cleaning the house, hanging the same paper streamers she'd hung for every birthday in my childhood, because I knew she'd notice if I used new ones. Weston arrived an hour late with a bakery cake and a gift bag, and within 20 minutes of walking in the door, he pulled Grandma aside into the den. I only overheard part of the conversation because I was refilling the coffee pot in the kitchen, but I heard enough. He was asking her again about the house. Not directly. He was asking her, in the careful, testing way he asked things, when he wanted an answer he could use later, whether she'd thought about what happens to everything, and whether she thought it was fair that I was basically living here for free. Grandma's answer, which I only learned about weeks later when she told me herself, laughing about it like it was a funny story rather than the warning it actually was this. Free? Weston, honey, she gave up her whole life for me. If anyone's living here for free, it was you every time you needed bail money out of my purse. He didn't bring it up again after that, not directly. But I noticed over the following months that his visits got shorter and less frequent, and that when he did come, he started photographing things. A vase here, a cabinet there. Nothing obvious enough to accuse him of anything. Just enough, I understand now, to build himself a mental inventory of a house he'd already decided, in some part of his mind, belonged to him. By the time Grandma passed, on a Sunday morning in early spring, quietly, in her sleep, in the bed she'd shared with my grandfather for 41 years before he died, I had been her full-time, unpaid caregiver for 3 years and 2 months. I had missed weddings, a graduation, 4 Thanksgivings with anyone besides her, and most of what people my age consider a normal social life. I had also gained something I didn't fully understand the value of until it was gone. 3 years of knowing, completely and without ambiguity, exactly who my grandmother was. Weston, at the funeral 4 days later, knew exactly one thing about her for certain, that the house she died in was now, in his mind, his. The next morning was when the U-Haul showed up, and everything from that point moved fast, in the specific way that disasters move fast, each new development arriving before you finished absorbing the last one. The eviction notice was the first sealing, I told myself, standing in the kitchen with that misspelled piece of paper in my hand, that surely once he calmed down, once the funeral fog cleared, he'd realize how insane it was to hand his sister an eviction notice less than 24 hours after burying their grandmother. I called him that night. I kept my voice level. I said, Weston, I've lived here for 3 years. I took care of her. Can we please just talk about this like adults before you do anything else? His response was to laugh, actually laugh, a short, dry sound through the phone. Talk about what? There's nothing to talk about. You've had a free ride for 3 years. That ride's over. That was the second ceiling, and I broke through my own instinct to stay calm and told him that I hadn't had a free ride, that I'd sacrificed a career and a relationship and most of my 20s, and he cut me off before I finished the sentence. Nobody made you do that, he said. That was your choice. Don't act like a martyr about it now. I hung up because I could feel myself about to cry, and I didn't want to give him that. I spent that night packing a bag of essentials, not because I'd accepted I was leaving, but because some old, tired part of me had already braced for losing, the way you sometimes brace for a fight. You know deep down you're not going to win, even when you haven't given up on winning it yet. The third ceiling was the U-Haul itself, the frat boys, the destruction of her dresser, and the theft of the quilt and the jewelry box. I want to be specific about the jewelry box because it mattered more than the objects inside it. Grandma's mother, my great-grandmother, had been a widow in rural Kansas who raised 4 children by taking in sewing work, and the Wren brooch had been the one nice thing she ever owned, a gift from a wealthy woman she'd sewn for, given to her the year before she died. Grandma used to take it out sometimes and tell me the story, always ending the same way. Some things aren't about money, Danny. They're about who a person was. Weston dumped it into a black garbage bag alongside a tangle of costume jewelry and a broken watch, treating 80 years of family history like scrap for a resale app. The fourth ceiling was my mother's arrival, and her question, why can't you just be happy for your brother? Delivered with a hand on my shoulder that felt less like comfort and more like restraint. I want to explain my mother's role in this honestly, because it would be easy to make her either a villain or a bystander, and she was really neither. My mother had spent her whole life managing Weston's moods the way you manage weather, adjusting her own behavior around whatever storm he was currently generating, because it was easier than confronting him and risking the kind of explosive reaction he'd been having since he was a teenager. She wasn't malicious toward me. She was simply, chronically, unwilling to be the person who told Weston no. That unwillingness had a cost, and for most of my life, I'd been the one paying it. I tried, standing there on the porch with her hand still on my shoulder, to explain what I'd just watched happen. The dresser, the quilt, the jewelry box tipped into a garbage bag. She listened with the particular half-attention she reserved for conflicts she'd already decided not to fully engage with. He's grieving too, in his own way, she said. Men process things differently. I told her that dumping our great-grandmother's brooch into a trash bag wasn't a grieving process. It was theft with extra steps, and she winced at the word theft the way she always winced when anyone used a word sharp enough to actually describe what Weston did instead of what he meant to do. Don't make this uglier than it has to be, Danny, she said, and I remember thinking even then, before I understood how much uglier it was about to get, that the request itself was the whole problem. She wasn't asking Weston and not to make it ugly. She was asking me to keep absorbing it quietly, the way I'd been absorbing things quietly for 3 years, so that nobody else would have to feel the weight of it. There was one more moment before that, one I still turn over more than almost any other from that morning, because it's the one where I came closest to simply giving up. One of the frat brothers, the one who'd shouldered past me in the doorway earlier, carried out a box marked "Fragile" in Grandma's own handwriting, a box I knew held her Christmas ornaments, including a hand-painted one my grandfather had bought her in Germany during his time stationed there in the 60s. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, to please set it down, that it wasn't part of anything Weston had a right to sell. He looked past me at Weston, silently asking permission, the way you'd check with a manager before honoring a customer complaint you didn't personally care about either way. Weston just shrugged and said, "Load it, it's fine, she's being dramatic." And the boy carried it past me to the truck without another word, and I remember standing there thinking that I had officially become invisible in my own grandmother's house, a minor obstacle to be walked around rather than a person to be answered. I might have kept absorbing it too, might have let that 5th or 6th ceiling arrive and simply raised my hands over my head to catch it the way I always had if Mr. Holloway's car hadn't turned into the driveway right then. Each of those 4 ceilings should have been the worst moment of that morning. Each time, I thought, surely it can't get worse than this. And each time, within minutes, it did. That's the shape manipulation takes when you're inside it and can't see the shape yet. It doesn't arrive as one clean blow. It arrives as a staircase, and you don't realize how far down you've gone until you look up and can't see the top anymore. The 5th ceiling arrived in the form of a gray sedan turning into the driveway. Mr. Holloway had been Grandma's attorney for 11 years, ever since she updated her paperwork following my grandfather's death. I'd met him twice before, both times for brief, boring conversations about power of attorney documents that I'd signed without fully reading, the way you sign most of the paperwork that surrounds a dying relative, because there's simply too much of it to absorb while you're also trying to keep the person alive. He got out of his car, took one look at the half-loaded U-Haul, and I watched something in his expression shift from professional neutrality into something closer to alarm. "Weston," he called out, "what exactly are you doing with your sister's property?" I'll admit there was a strange, small comfort in hearing an outside adult, someone with no emotional stake in our family's decades of dysfunction, immediately name what was happening as wrong. I'd spent 3 years having my sacrifices minimized by my own mother. Hearing a stranger in a gray suit call the house my property, even before I understood the legal reasoning behind it, felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on all morning. Weston's answer was immediate and confident, the confidence of someone who has never once been told no by the people who mattered most in his life. "She doesn't own anything here. There's no will. I'm the oldest grandchild. It's mine." Mr. Holloway didn't flinch. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick, tabbed, clearly prepared in advance. "There's no will," he agreed, "which means the estate follows state intestacy law, and state law isn't what you think it is." Weston smirked at him, that same smirk he'd worn at my toys held over my head, at Grandma's jewelry held out of reach, an expression built entirely on the assumption that he already knew how this ended. "Exactly, so it's mine." "No, Mr. Holloway said, and I watched him unfold a document with a raised seal at the top. Under this state's caregiver priority statute, when someone provides full-time, uncompensated care for an elderly relative for a continuous period exceeding 2 years, and that relative dies without a valid will, that caregiver receives statutory priority in the distribution of the estate over other heirs of equal degree. Your sister moved in 3 years ago. She quit her job. She managed medications, physical therapy appointments, financial affairs, and daily living needs. That's not sentiment. That's a legal fact pattern, and it's documented." The driveway went dead silent. Even the frat boys, mid-carry with a box of Grandma's china, stopped moving. "That's not a real law," Weston said, and for the first time that morning I heard something under his confidence crack. "It's very real," Mr. Holloway said, "and it's been on this state's books since 2011. I'd encourage you to have your own attorney review it, but I'd also encourage you to stop loading that truck in the meantime, because everything currently in it may constitute conversion of estate property, which is a civil claim, and depending on the total value, potentially a criminal one." "I have a job," Weston snapped. "I can't just visit whenever I want." "She had a job too," Mr. Holloway said, calm, almost gentle, in a way that somehow landed harder than anger would have. "She gave it up so your grandmother wouldn't die alone in a facility." "When did you last visit before yesterday's funeral?" Weston's face went a shade of red I recognized from childhood, the color that meant he was searching for a comeback and not finding one fast enough. "I'm the successful one," he said, which wasn't an answer to the question, which none of us missed. "You visited twice in 3 years, both times to ask her for money." That last part was true, and hearing him say it out loud, in front of Mr. Holloway and our mother and his 4 fraternity brothers standing frozen mid-box, seemed to surprise even him, like he'd meant to say something else, and this had come out instead, the truth slipping loose from underneath the story he'd built. "The house, the accounts, and the remaining estate go to the grandchild who provided documented care," Mr. Holloway said, and he turned to me, holding out a set of keys and a small sealed envelope. "She wanted you to have this. She gave it to me for safekeeping 6 months ago, along with instructions." My hands were shaking when I opened the envelope. Inside was a note in Grandma's handwriting, which had gotten shakier over the last year, but but was still unmistakably hers, still looping the same way it looped on birthday cards since before I could read. My special baby. They called you the family failure for not chasing the money like your brother did. Not anymore. Everything I have is because of what you gave up. I see it. I've always seen it. I read it twice before I could look up. When I did, Weston's face had gone from red to something paler, something closer to gray. He grabbed the nearest frat brother by the arm and started backing toward the truck, and I thought for one relieved second that it was over, that the worst of it had happened, and was now finished happening. Then he stopped at the open cab door, turned back, and said something quiet enough that only I could hear it over the sound of the truck's idling engine. "This isn't over," he said. "You have no idea what I found in her filing cabinet before you got here this morning." I didn't understand what he meant, not then. I stood frozen on the porch, note shaking in my hand, watching his truck reverse out of the driveway too fast, clipping the edge of the mailbox post on the way out, a small, petty destruction that felt, somehow, exactly like him. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. That night, after Mr. Holloway left with instructions to call him the following week to begin the formal probate process, and after my mother left without apologizing, without even really acknowledging what had happened, just murmuring something about how she hoped Weston and I could work things out eventually, I walked through the house alone for the first time since the funeral. It felt different already. Rooms feel different once you know, legally, that they're yours, even if the knowing hasn't fully settled into your body yet. I went into Grandma's study, the small room off the kitchen where she kept her filing cabinet, the ancient beige four-drawer thing that had survived 2 moves and probably 3 decades. Weston's words kept circling back at me. "You have no idea what I found in her filing cabinet before you got here this morning." I pulled open the top drawer. Tax documents, going back further than they needed to, because Grandma never threw anything away that had a government seal on it. Second drawer, medical records, insurance statements, the paper trail of 3 years of appointments I'd driven her to. Third drawer, mostly empty, a few old photographs loose at the bottom, curling at the edges. The fourth drawer, the bottom one, was the one that stopped me. It was where Grandma had always kept what she called her important papers, deeds, the title to the house, my grandfather's discharge papers from the army, and, I'd always assumed, whatever version of a will existed before Mr. Holloway's office told us there wasn't one. The drawer wasn't empty, but it wasn't full either. There were gaps, visible gaps, the kind you notice when you've seen a space organized a certain way for years, and someone has quietly removed things from it. 2 folders were missing their labels entirely, just torn paper edges left behind where a label sticker used to sit. A third folder, still there, had been resealed with tape that didn't match the rest of the cabinet's aging yellowed tape. Tape that was clearly new, clearly recent, clearly someone's attempt to make a disturbed folder look undisturbed. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time, going through what remained, trying to remember what should have been there and wasn't. I remembered, vaguely, Grandma once showing me a folder labeled property, years earlier, back when I was helping her organize the cabinet during a slow Sunday afternoon in my first year living there. I remembered a folder labeled WT, which I'd never asked about, assuming it stood for something administrative, a bank or a utility company with those initials. Both of those folders were gone. I didn't sleep much that night. Around midnight, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the old nightstand, Grandma's nightstand, still smelling faintly of her hand lotion, even 3 weeks after she'd stopped needing it. A text from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no area code I could place immediately, just a string of digits and 3 words. Check the will. I stared at that message until the screen dimmed and went dark on its own. I typed back, "Who is this?" 3 separate times and deleted it 3 separate times before finally sending it. No response came. Not that night and not the next morning either. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't fear exactly, though there was some of that mixed in. Mostly what I felt was a kind of grim, exhausted recognition. Some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years learning exactly what my brother was capable of in small, private, deniable ways, wasn't surprised at all. I'd learned over those 3 years that Weston's cruelty rarely announced itself directly. It arrived sideways, in things he didn't say, in visits he didn't make, in a filing cabinet quietly missing 2 folders while the rest of the family was inside, choosing which of Grandma's dresses she'd be buried in. I called Mr. Holloway first thing the next morning. He listened to my description of the missing folders without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he said something that reframed the entire situation for me. "Danielle," he said, "your grandmother came to my office 6 months ago and told me she was worried about exactly this. She told me Weston had been asking questions about the estate that felt less like curiosity and more like reconnaissance. She asked me to prepare something in case he tried anything before or after her death. I have copies." She insisted on it. That was the moment the story stopped being simply about grief and inheritance and started being about something my grandmother had seen coming months before any of us and had quietly, deliberately prepared for. Mr. Holloway asked me to come to his office that afternoon. I remember very little about the drive there, only that my hands stayed tight on the wheel the entire way, and that I kept glancing at my phone at every red light, half expecting another anonymous text, another 3 words rearranging everything again. His office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of building that made you feel, walking in, like whatever news waited inside would be formal and consequential. He sat me down across from his desk and opened a folder of his own. A folder I understood immediately was a copy of whatever Weston had stolen from the filing cabinet. Your grandmother, he said, did leave a will, a formal one, drafted and notarized 14 months before she died. She chose not to keep the original at the house, specifically because of a conversation she'd had with Weston the previous fall. A conversation she described to me as, in her words, him fishing to find out what I was worth and where I kept my paperwork. I thought immediately of the 80th birthday party, the overheard fragment of conversation in the den, Grandma's laughing retelling of it weeks later. I hadn't understood at the time that it was the beginning of something, rather than an isolated, forgettable incident. Mr. Holloway slid the will across the desk. I want to describe what was in it, because the specifics mattered, because Grandma had clearly thought through every detail with a precision that surprised even me, and I'd thought I knew her completely. The house, appraised at $340,000, was left to me outright. Her savings and investment accounts, totaling roughly $190,000, were split, but not evenly. I received 70%. Weston received 30%, structured as a testamentary trust rather than a lump sum, released to him only in staged increments over 5 years, and only if he completed. And this was the detail that made me actually gasp out loud in that office. 60 hours of documented volunteer service to an elder care organization each year, the trust remained active. She didn't want to cut him out entirely, Mr. Holloway said, watching my face as I read. She told me, and I'm quoting her directly because I wrote it down at the time, I don't want to punish him. I want to teach him. Maybe it's too late for that, but I want to try. There was a second document in the folder, a personal letter, sealed separately, addressed to Weston, that Mr. Holloway had not yet given him because, per Grandma's instructions, it was only to be delivered once the will was formally read and accepted. I didn't read that letter. It wasn't mine to read, but Mr. Holloway told me, in general terms, what it contained. An accounting of every dollar Weston had ever borrowed from her without repaying it, totaling just over $11,000 across 6 separate instances going back to his sophomore year of college, alongside a plainly written explanation of why she'd structured the trust the way she had, not as punishment, as a door left open, on the condition that he walk through it honestly. I asked Mr. Holloway why she hadn't just told Weston any of this while she was alive, why she'd waited to let a folder and a lawyer say what she never said to his face. He was quiet for a second, the way people get quiet when they're choosing whether to share something a client told them in confidence. She tried once, he finally said, about a year before she died. She told him, gently, that she'd noticed a pattern, and that she hoped he'd think about it. He told her she was being manipulated by you, that you'd turned her against him. She never brought it up again after that. She told me she didn't want her last years with him to be nothing but arguments. She said she'd rather leave the hard conversation in writing, where he could sit with it without an audience, than spend her remaining time fighting him about it in person. That detail undid me more than almost anything else that day. I thought about all the mornings I'd sat with Grandma over coffee, all the small confidences she'd shared with me about recipes and switchboard jobs and road trips to Memphis, and I understood for the first time that she'd been carrying this particular worry mostly alone, choosing silence with her own grandson to protect whatever peace remained between them, right up until the very end. The final piece of information Mr. Holloway gave me that afternoon was the one that finally connected everything: the anonymous text, the missing folders, the tape that didn't match the cabinet's age. There's a witness, he said. Your grandmother's neighbor Priscilla has a video doorbell camera that faces partially toward your grandmother's front walk. I subpoenaed the footage this morning, as a precaution, once you told me about the missing folders. It shows Weston's car in the driveway at 6:45 in the morning on the day of the funeral, 45 minutes before anyone else arrived. He was inside the house for 11 minutes. He left carrying what the footage shows to be 2 manila folders under his arm. I sat with that for a long moment before I asked the question that had been building in me since midnight. Is that illegal, what he did? It's several things, Mr. Holloway said carefully. It's likely theft of estate documents. Depending on what he intended to do with a will he believed named him as sole heir, or what he intended to do with a will that didn't yet exist as far as he knew, it could also constitute an attempt to conceal or destroy testamentary documents, which carries its own criminal exposure in this state. Whether we pursue that formally is entirely your decision. I'd recommend, at minimum, that he understand we know. I sent the text that afternoon, the same afternoon I read the will. Not the anonymous 3 words I'd received the night before, whose sender I never did identify with certainty, though I've always suspected it was one of the frat brothers, someone with a conscience larger than the others, someone who'd seen more of what happened in that house before the funeral than they were comfortable staying quiet about. I sent Weston a text of my own instead. 4 words: we need to talk. He called within 2 minutes. Before you say anything, I told him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, I know about the filing cabinet, I know about the 2 folders, I know about the doorbell camera at Priscilla's house. I know you were in that house at 6:45 in the morning, 45 minutes before anyone else, on the day we buried our grandmother. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, could picture, without wanting to, the exact expression his face would be making, the one from childhood when he'd been caught and was rapidly calculating his way out of it. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. It had the thin, brittle quality of someone reciting a line he no longer believed himself. "There's a will, Weston," I said. "There's always been a will. Grandma had it drafted 14 months ago because she was worried about exactly what you did yesterday morning." "That's not possible," he said. "Holloway said there was no will. He said intestacy law. He said that in front of you because that's what he believed you already thought was true," I said. "Grandma didn't keep the original at the house. She kept it with him. She told him you'd been asking questions that felt like reconnaissance." Her word, not mine. Another silence. Longer this time. "I want to see Mom, and you, and Holloway, together," I said, "this weekend. I want the will read properly, formally, the way she wanted it done. And I want you to bring back whatever's in those 2 folders you took. Because right now, the only thing standing between this being a family matter and this being a police matter is me, and I'd genuinely rather it stay a family matter if you can manage to let it." He agreed, in a voice much smaller than the one that had told me I had 30 days to clear out of my own home 2 days earlier. We met that Saturday, at Mr. Holloway's office rather than the house, which felt right, felt like neutral ground in a way the house, with all its fresh wounds, couldn't have offered. My mother arrived first, sitting stiffly in the waiting area, avoiding my eyes in a way that told me she already suspected, on some level, that whatever was about to happen would require her to finally take a side she'd spent 30 years avoiding. Weston arrived 12 minutes late, carrying a slim leather folder under his arm that I understood, immediately, held the 2 missing files. Mr. Holloway conducted the reading formally, the way he was legally required to, walking through the document line by line. I watched my mother's face as the numbers were read aloud. $340,000 for the house, $190,000 in accounts split 70-30. The staged trust conditions requiring 60 hours of annual volunteer service. I watched Weston's jaw tighten with each new detail, watched him do the math in real time, watched the exact moment he understood that even his 30% came with strings attached, come with a door he'd have to actually walk through rather than simply collect a check for standing near. "This is insane," he said when Mr. Holloway finished. "She's punishing me from beyond the grave." "She's not punishing you," I said, and I felt something steady settle into my voice that hadn't been there in the driveway 2 days before, hadn't been there through 3 years of quietly absorbing every unfair comparison our mother made between us. "She loved you. That's the part you keep missing. If she didn't love you, she wouldn't have left you anything at all, and she definitely wouldn't have spent time writing you a letter explaining why she structured it this way instead of just cutting you off and letting you find out from a lawyer with no context. She gave you a door, Weston. Whether you walk through it is up to you. You don't get to lecture me about what family means," he snapped. "You got the house. You got 70%. You got everything, and you're standing there acting like you're the generous one." "I got everything because I earned it," I said, and my voice did shake slightly on that word, earned, because 3 years of earning something is a heavier thing to say out loud than it looks on paper. "I quit my job. I gave up my 20s. I bathed her. I sat with her through nights she couldn't remember who I was because of a UTI messing with her head, and I never once made her feel like a burden for it because she wasn't one. You visited 11 times in 3 years, Weston. 2 of those visits, you asked her for money, and instead of accepting that, instead of even trying to understand why she made the choice she made, you drove a U-Haul full of your frat brothers to her house the morning after her funeral and started selling her jewelry before her body was even cold in the ground." The room went very quiet. I could see my mother, out of the corner of my eye, pressing a hand against her mouth, and I understood, watching her, that this was the first time she was hearing the full accounting of it laid out plainly, in one place, rather than absorbed in scattered pieces over 3 years the way I'd been absorbing it. "Grandma saw exactly who you were," I said, quieter now, the anger draining out and leaving something closer to grief in its place. "She saw it clearly enough to hire a lawyer and move her will out of the house so you couldn't destroy it. She saw it clearly enough to write you a letter accounting for $11,000 you never paid back, and she still, even after all of that, gave you a door. That's not punishment, Weston. That's more grace than I think either of us would have given you, honestly, if it had been up to us instead of her." "You don't know what it's like," Weston said suddenly, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was maybe 15, the year our parents' divorce first started to feel permanent instead of temporary. Being the one everyone expects things from. Dad left, and suddenly, I was supposed to be the man of the house at 12. Mom needed me to be fine so she didn't have to worry about both of us falling apart at once. Nobody ever asked if I was okay. They just assumed I would be, because I was the oldest, because I was the boy. You got to be the sensitive one. I never got to be anything except fine. I didn't say anything for a moment, because there was something true buried inside what he'd said, some real wound underneath the excuse, and I didn't want to pretend otherwise just because I was angry. "I believe that," I finally told him. "I believe nobody ever checked on you the way they should have. But Weston, that happened 30 years ago. Grandma checked on you. Every visit, every phone call. She asked how you were doing. Really asked. And you gave her a rehearsed answer and left. She was trying to give you exactly what you're saying you never got. And you used every one of those chances to ask her for money instead. That's not fair," he said. But it came out quieter than his other objections had, less certain of itself. "None of this has been fair," I said. "Not to either of us, probably in different ways. But you don't get to use a wound from being 12 to justify what you did at 28. You're not a kid anymore. You had a choice standing in that driveway, and you chose a garbage bag for her jewelry." Weston sat there for a long moment, his leather folder still tucked under his arm, unopened, the 2 stolen files still inside it, and something something in his face finally cracked, not into remorse, not yet, but into something closer to the panic of a person realizing, for the first time in his adult life, that a version of events he'd always relied on other people accepting simply wasn't going to be accepted anymore. He slid the leather folder across the table without a word. Mr. Holloway opened it, confirmed the 2 missing documents were inside, intact, and noted for the record that they'd been returned voluntarily. It was the smallest, quietest concession Weston made that entire meeting, and it was also, I think, the first honest thing he'd done since the funeral. The aftermath spread out over the following months in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, the way real consequences always seem to move slower and touch more corners of a life than the dramatic confrontation that triggers them. My mother and I didn't speak for 6 weeks after that meeting at Mr. Holloway's office. I think she needed that time to sit with what she'd finally heard clearly, the full weight of 3 years she'd allowed herself to minimize, because minimizing was easier than confronting her son. When she finally called, she didn't apologize outright, not in so many words, but she said something close enough. "I should have come more," she said, "to help you with her. I let myself believe you had it handled because it was easier than admitting I didn't want to face what handling it would have cost me. It wasn't everything I might have wanted to hear, but it was more honesty than I'd gotten from her in years, and I decided to let it be enough of a start. We've had 2 or 3 harder conversations since then, the kind that used to feel impossible between us." She told me one evening over decaf at her kitchen table that part of why she'd always gone easy on Weston was guilt of her own, something about how the divorce had hit him harder and more visibly than it hit me, how she'd spent years overcorrecting for a wound in him she'd never properly overcorrected for in herself. I don't think that excuses 30 years of looking away, but I think it explains it, and there's a difference between an excuse and an explanation, one I've had to learn to sit with if I want any relationship with her at all going forward. We're not close in the way I sometimes wish we were, but we're closer than we were the morning she stood in that driveway asking me why I couldn't be happy for my brother, and for now, that's the version of progress I've decided to accept. Weston, for his part, made 2 more attempts to relitigate the will before finally giving up. The first was a call to his own attorney, a consultation that apparently cost him $400, and produced the unwelcome news that the caregiver statute and the will itself were both airtight, and that any formal challenge would likely just burn through legal fees he didn't have to spare, given that 30% of the estate was now locked in a trust he couldn't touch without meeting its conditions. The second attempt was a long, rambling voicemail he left me at 2 in the morning about 6 weeks after the reading, half apologetic and half accusatory in the same breath, blaming Grandma, blaming me, blaming our mother for favoring me his whole life, a claim so far removed from the reality either my mother or I had actually lived that I didn't even bother responding to it. Word of what happened traveled through the wider family faster than I expected, the way it always does once one person decides to stop protecting the story's least flattering details. My Aunt Rhonda, Grandma's younger sister, called me from Tucson about 3 weeks after the reading, and I braced myself for another version of my mother's response, another request to smooth things over for the sake of peace. Instead, she said something that surprised me enough that I wrote it down afterward, on a sticky note I still have folded into the front of a kitchen drawer. "Your grandmother called me the week she signed that will," Rhonda said. "She told me she was scared of what would happen at the house once she was gone, and she made me promise that if Weston ever tried to make you feel crazy for defending yourself, I'd tell you plainly that you weren't. So, you weren't." One small specific piece of that morning did resolve itself, though it took nearly 4 months. The box of Christmas ornaments, the one marked fragile in Grandma's handwriting, the one holding my grandfather's hand-painted piece from Germany, turned up in the back of Weston's storage unit when he finally, under the threat of a formal demand letter from Mr. Holloway, agreed to return whatever remained unsold from that morning's haul. Most of it had already been sold off through a resale app in the days immediately after the funeral, before Mr. Holloway's intervention froze anything further from leaving the house. But the ornament box, apparently, nobody had gotten around to listing yet. I unwrapped my grandfather's ornament that December, alone in the living room, and cried harder over that single piece of hand-painted glass than I had over almost anything else in the entire ordeal, because it was small enough, specific enough, to finally let the grief through in a form I could actually hold in my hands. Rhonda ended up being the one who talked my cousin Marcus out of getting involved on Weston's side, which I hadn't even known was a risk until she mentioned it. Marcus and Weston had been close as kids. Close enough that Marcus's first instinct, hearing a second-hand and heavily edited version of events from Weston himself, had been to text me something short and cold about how families shouldn't fight over money. Rhonda apparently called him directly and walked him through the actual timeline, the caregiver statute, the missing folders, the doorbell footage, and Marcus texted me 2 days later, a much longer message this time, apologizing for jumping to conclusions and admitting that Weston had left out roughly everything that mattered. There was an unexpected ally in all of this that I hadn't anticipated too. Priscilla, Grandma's neighbor of 19 years, the one whose doorbell camera had caught Weston's early morning visit, came by the house about 2 months after the funeral with a casserole dish and an apology she didn't owe me. "I should have said something sooner," she told me, standing on the porch that Weston had once stood on with an eviction notice. "I've watched that boy grow up thinking the world owed him something since he was in middle school. Your grandmother used to talk to me about it, you know. She worried about him more than she worried about you, because she said you at least knew how to survive on your own. She said he never learned that, and she was scared of what he'd become without ever learning it. I asked her carefully if she'd been the one who sent the midnight text. She smiled in a way that told me either yes or that she knew who had, and said only, "Whoever sent that text just wanted to make sure the truth found its way to the right person. Sometimes that's all a person can do." There were logistical complications too, the unglamorous kind that never make it into the dramatic parts of a story, but eat up real weeks of real life. Transferring the deed took 11 weeks and required 3 separate notarized documents. The trust for Weston's 30% needed a court-appointed trustee, since Grandma had specified in her will that it shouldn't be me, a detail that stung slightly less once I understood her reasoning, written plainly in the document itself. "I don't want to put my grandchildren in the position of managing each other's money. They deserve better than a lifetime of resenting each other over a spreadsheet." A local non-profit fiduciary agreed to administer it for an annual fee of $1,200, paid out of the trust itself. There were tax complications too, the kind nobody warns you about when they picture inheriting a house. The county reassessed the property at a higher value than Grandma's decades-old tax basis, which meant a jump in annual property tax I hadn't budgeted for, close to $1,800 more a year than what she'd been paying. I had to have the electrical panel inspected before I could refinance anything, since it was original to a renovation from 1988 and no longer met code, a repair that ran just under $4,000 once the contractor was done. I paid for it out of my share of the accounts, the same accounts that were supposed to feel like a windfall and mostly just felt, that first year, like a slow negotiation with one expense after another, each one a small reminder that inheriting a life doesn't erase the cost of maintaining it. Weston's attorney sent one final letter about 5 months after the reading, a half-hearted inquiry into whether I'd consider a private settlement outside the terms of the trust, some lump sum in exchange for him waiving future claims. Mr. Halloway's response was 2 sentences long and ended the conversation permanently. I kept a copy of that letter in the same drawer as Rhonda's sticky note, not out of spite, but because some part of me wanted proof on paper that I hadn't imagined how hard he'd fought against the very door Grandma had built for him. There was also, briefly, a dispute over Grandma's car, a 12-year-old sedan with under 60,000 miles on it that hadn't been specifically named in the will and technically fell under the general residual clause, which meant it belonged to me along with everything else not otherwise itemized. Weston called twice about the car specifically, arguing that he'd always been promised it verbally, a promise nobody else in the family had ever heard Grandma make. I ended up selling it to a young couple down the street for $4,000 and donating half of that to the same elder care nonprofit whose volunteer hours now governed Weston's trust, less because the money mattered, and more because I liked the quiet, private irony of it, a irony I never once mentioned to him. I also had a quiet moment, sometime around the 4th month, sitting alone in Grandma's study with the mismatched tape still stuck to the edge of that 4th drawer, where I let myself grieve something I hadn't let myself grieve yet, which wasn't Grandma exactly, because I'd been grieving her since the morning she died, but the brother I might have had if things had gone differently. I thought about him at 6 years old, before either of us understood money or inheritance or who our family expected us to become, back when he used to let me ride on his bike pegs down the block and would only laugh, not sneer, when I fell off. I let myself sit with the fact that whatever that 6-year-old might have grown into, this wasn't it, and that some part of me would always wonder what specific turn, what specific moment of our mother choosing not to say no to him had set him on the path toward becoming a man who could load a U-Haul the morning after his grandmother's funeral. I still live in the house. I kept Grandma's rose bushes, the ones Weston cropped out of his listing photos, and this past June they bloomed heavier than they have in years, which the extension office lady I called about it said probably had to do with a particularly wet spring, but which I've decided to believe had something to do with Grandma, in whatever way you're allowed to believe things like that without anyone accusing you of being unscientific about it. I finished the quilt this spring, the one that survived the frat boys pulling it out of my hands, finally sewing the border we'd talked about adding but never got around to before she died. It's on my bed now, in what used to be the guest room and is now simply my room, no longer temporary, no longer borrowed. Weston and I speak maybe 4 times a year, mostly logistics, mostly brief. He completed his first 60 hours of volunteer service at an elder care facility this past winter, grudgingly, according to our mother, who's the one who told me about it, because he still won't talk to me about anything that touches the estate directly. I don't know if it changed anything in him. I don't know if it was ever supposed to, in 1 year, undo whatever pattern took 28 years to build, but I know Grandma believed a door mattered more than a locked one, even for someone who might never walk through it, and I've decided that believing what she believed, at least about this, is the closest thing I have left to keeping her here with me. I got a new job eventually, part-time at first, doing marketing work for the same elder care nonprofit that ended up administering Weston's trust, which felt like an odd, almost too neat kind of symmetry when the offer came through, the kind of thing you'd cut from a story for being unbelievable if it hadn't actually happened. I write newsletters now about caregiver burnout, about the specific, unglamorous exhaustion of loving someone through their decline, the kind of exhaustion nobody hands you a manual for. I think about Grandma every time I sit down to write one, and I think too about the version of myself who used to scream into a pillow in a parked car, who deserves to know that all of it eventually led somewhere steadier. I dated someone for a while last year, a man named Theo who ran the volunteer coordination coordination desk at that same nonprofit, and one of the first real conversations we had was about my grandmother, about the will, about Weston. He asked me gently whether I ever worried I'd become like her, structuring my whole life around taking care of someone else at the expense of myself. It's a fair question, and I've turned it over more than once since he asked it. I don't think the answer is simple. I think there's a difference between disappearing into someone else's needs because you don't believe you deserve anything of your own, and choosing, with open eyes, to give 3 years of your life to a person who loved you completely and unconditionally for 23 years before that. I gave up a lot in that house, but I don't think I lost myself in it. If anything, I think I finally found out, at 23, exactly what I was capable of when something mattered enough. People ask me sometimes when this story comes up whether I regret those 3 years, whether I'd do it again, knowing what waited for me on the other side of it, the eviction notice, the U-Haul, the jewelry dumped into a garbage bag like scrap. I always tell them the same thing. I didn't do it for a house. I didn't even do it, not really, for an inheritance I didn't know was coming. I did it because she was mine to take care of, and because some things aren't about money. They're about who a person was and who you become by staying, when staying is the harder and less rewarded choice. I still think about the 6-year-old version of Weston sometimes, and I let myself feel sad about him, separately from how I feel about the man he became. That sadness doesn't cancel out what happened in the driveway, it just sits alongside it. Grief is rarely one clean feeling. Sometimes it's missing a woman who raised you and mourning a brother who's still alive, in the same breath, on the same ordinary Tuesday, folding laundry in a house that finally, fully belongs to you. My brother showed up to our grandmother's funeral with an eviction notice and a U-Haul full of frat boys, certain the house was already his. He never once asked what it cost me to earn it. And I think, in the end, that question, the one he never thought to ask, was the whole answer to everything that came after.